to welcome you today to our celebration of the landmark and historic 1964 Civil Rights Act. We are honoring, remembering, and most importantly, assessing our civil rights history as part of our mission to serve as a research center and a repository for information pertaining to civil rights and the culture of African Americans. We have a special focus, of course, on history of Montgomery, the role of the African American community here, and the role of Valda University in this great history. On behalf of our steering committee, I welcome you again, and I thank you for being with us. I invite you to also enjoy the art around us as part of the Malden Art Community Show. And so we are happy again to have you. We want to thank in advance our forum participants who are here today. And we will assess and hear their conversations about the impact of this landmark case. I can remember many of the leaders of the civil rights movement, and often they would have this expression saying, we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And I can remember Miss Johnny Carr particularly saying that. So it begs the question that we will analyze today, how far have we come? So I welcome you again, and I thank you and hope you enjoy our program today.
To provide some context for today's program, we put together, or spliced together, a series of clips that give you some context for the 64 Civil Rights Act, how it came into being, the legislative challenges, the influence of the modern civil rights movement on that legislation. So I'd like to play that clip. It's about 9 minutes, and then we will proceed with the rest of our program.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities. Whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if in short he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet free from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet free from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
It is 1963, and black Americans are struggling against the racial injustice and widespread violence inflicted upon them. Their outcry has led President John F. Kennedy to propose a sweeping new civil rights bill. On November 22, 1963, the president's vision of the future, including his hope to end segregation, is about to be crushed. The nation is stunned, and the fate of Kennedy's civil rights bill is now in the hands of a former senator from Texas.
This is a sad time for all people. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help.
At the end of that terrible day, as Lyndon Johnson returns to his residence, he knows he must make a crucial decision that will affect his entire presidency and the nation he must now lead. President Lyndon Johnson is faced with a dilemma. Civil rights is the nation's biggest domestic issue. but to take further action could set off a political firestorm, especially in the South.
Kennedy in 1960 had given the impression when he was running for president that he would be, if elected, a great civil rights president. He said, if I'm elected, I'm going to end discrimination against black Americans with a stroke of the pen.
But by 1963, Kennedy had done little to end segregation. He didn't want to alienate white Southern politicians who had been firmly opposed to granting civil rights to blacks. Politicians he needed for his other program. The proposed civil rights bill would make it illegal for public places such as restaurants, hotels, and movie theaters to ban black customers.
No, sir, you cannot be admitted. Why? I'm not going to serve you because of my race. I'm not going to serve you because of my race. Move on.
Civil rights was possible. Not just possible, it was needed by the country. Hundreds of people had protested in every quarter. They'd been met by brutality. Hoses turned on, buses set afire. Some people, all the black leaders at the time, Roy Wilkins and Dr. Martin Luther King, Dorothy Heidy, them all. And I think at first there was a lack of trust. But later on, they began to realize that this land was made of steel.
The evening of his second day in office, President Johnson receives a phone call from a concerned Martin Luther King.
I think one of the great tributes that we can pay in memory of President Kennedy is to try to enact some of the great progressive policies that he sought to initiate. But I'm going to support them all, and you can count on that, and I'm going to do my best to get other men to do likewise, and I'll have to have y'all's help. I never needed more than I do now. Well, you know you have it, and just feel free to call on us for anything. Thank you, sir.
Neither segregationists nor civil rights leaders could be sure about the new president's position on civil rights. But Johnson makes his tough call just 5 days after Kennedy's death in a stirring speech to Congress.
No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long.
Johnson has made his decision.
I remember that speech, and I remember the words of President Johnson. That was very reassuring.
If President Johnson hadn't immediately endorsed the Civil Rights Bill that Kennedy had put in and made a big deal out of it, I think he would have lost a good deal of support. He would have regained the South, which would have helped him in terms of renomination as president. Well, I think he was taking the risk either way.
Washington feels the impact of his announcement immediately. Johnson goes to work on Congress, using his political muscle to get the Civil Rights Bill passed. He knows his strong stance has angered many of his Southern friends in the Senate, friends whose support he will need in the coming election of 1960. Senator Richard Russell of Georgia is just about the most powerful person in the Senate, and he's dead set against the Civil Rights Bill.
We have not kept up to surrender in our opposition to this bill, which we feel is the version of the American way of life.
With great affection, the president grabbed Russell by the shoulder and he said, "Dick, I love you and I owe you. If you hadn't made me leader, I would never have become vice president. If I hadn't been vice president, I wouldn't be sitting where I am today. So all that I am, I owe you. Which is why I want to tell you, don't get in my way on this civil rights bill or I'll run you down." Remember Russell, in those rolling accents of his Georgia countryside, said, "Well, Mr. President," he said, "you may very well do that. But if you do, you're not only going to lose the election, you're going to lose the South forever." Johnson said in another soft voice, "Dick, if that's the price I've got to pay, I'll gladly pay it."
It's the day of decision on Capitol Hill as the U.S. Senate clears the way for the Civil Rights Bill by voting to limit debate on the measure. GOP leader Everett Dirksen left and Democratic whip Hubert Humphrey mustered 4 votes for. The House passes the measure. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson.
before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions, divisions which have lasted all too long. Its purpose is national, not regional. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country. So, tonight I urge every public official, every religious leader, every business and professional man, every working man, every housewife, I urge every American to join in this effort to bring justice and hope to all our people and to bring peace to our land.
There's warm applause from members of both parties as the President sets to work. It is work. He uses nearly 100 pens to affix his signature and date. Souvenirs go to Republican leader Everett Dirksen and Democratic whip Hewitt Humphrey. The President seems to have mastered the art of just touching each pen to the paper. Integration leader Martin Luther King receives his pen, a gift he said he would cherish. The Department of Justice will enforce the law if necessary, and G-Man Chief J. Edgar Hoover is present. Another group of pens is reserved for the Kennedys, and the Attorney General is entrusted with a half dozen. Now, in this summer of 1964, the Civil Rights Bill is the law of the land. In the words of the President, it restricts no one's freedom so long as he respects the rights of others.
Okay. I wanted to provide some context, and we spliced together a variety of clips that provide you with a basis for understanding the legislative role or the legislative path that the 1964 Civil Rights Act took. The 1964 Civil Rights Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Baines Johnson 50 years ago today, on July 2nd, 1964. So after a half century, this critical piece of legislation stands as a crowning accomplishment of the modern civil rights movement. The 1964 Act consists of 11 titles, each addressing a separate set of regulations, from Title I, which required voting rules to be applied to citizens equally across the nation, and Title VIII, requiring collective use of the collection and the use of voter registration data. Title IV encouraged the desegregation of public schools. Title VII prohibited workplace discrimination, and Title IX made it easier to move civil rights cases from biased state courts to less discriminatory federal courts. However, the most important clause in this landmark legislation could be found in Title II, which outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in hotels, motels, restaurants, theaters, and all other public accommodations engaged in interstate commerce. Congress used several different parts of the United States Constitution to provide the 1964 Act with legislative authority. The national legislature drew on the Constitution's power to regulate interstate commerce under Article I, Section 8, to guarantee all citizens equal protection of the law under the 14th Amendment, to protect voting rights under the 15th Amendment. Now, while detractors quickly challenged the legislation, the United States Supreme Court upheld the Civil Rights Act on December 14, 1964, in the heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States. This legislation, modeled after the 1875 Civil Rights Act, changed the state of American culture. The new law moved the nation closer to its promise that every individual, had an equal right to develop his or her talents to the fullest of their abilities. Moreover, the act helped reiterate the nation's commitment to end racial discrimination in all sectors of society. Armed with this new law, champions of racial equality joined by the United States Justice Department now had unprecedented tools to challenge persistent discrimination in educational institutions, in places of public accommodation, within the nation's political systems, and in public as well as private employment. While the 1964 Civil Rights Act held significant promise and embodied the long-standing aspirations of organizations like the NAACP and the SCLC, the law also spelled the end to an insular black community, as African Americans took advantage of newly won rights to patronize any theater or restaurant, to sleep in any hotel or use any place of amusement, all throughout the nation. Businesses that had almost exclusively catered to a segregated black clientele all but disappeared. Black schools, systematically underfunded and considered inferior, were closed. Black principals were demoted, black teachers were displaced. Neighborhoods populated by a full range of black families with different incomes and occupations now saw the black middle class and the black elite migrate to previously all white neighborhoods. So the act had both intended and unintended consequences. During the 1960s, America was continuing its transformation into one of the world's most culturally diverse countries. And the 1964 Civil Rights Act laid the foundation for at least an expectation of equality. Today, we have assembled a panel that I think could talk with some specificity about their own personal experiences related to the 1964 Act and its consequences. I'd like to invite to our dais and panel Attorney Solomon Seay, and is Mary Marshall. We've selected this panel for a very specific reason. One, they bring to the table a unique set of experiences from a variety of, or a range of areas in American life. And so, of course, we have Attorney Solomon Seay, who argued cases related to the Freedom Rides, the Selma Montgomery March, and other civil rights cases, but also argued cases in the aftermath of the 64 Civil Rights Act. We have Dr. Bryson, longtime professor, and now retired at Alabama State University, member of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity. And we have Dr. Valda Montgomery, who's led a storied life, sort of grew up in the eye of very important, or the center of very important civil rights events, episodes, that resonated nationally, but that heard here in Montgomery. She'll share some of her experiences. And then we have, of course, Nelson Malden, who is a longtime barber, was Martin Luther King's barber. Is still located at the base of the Benmore Hotel on the corner of Jackson and High Street. And he has some very poignant experiences. Now, one of the reasons we know that they have these experiences is because each one of these individuals, with the exception of you, no, you too, Val. Everybody has participated in Alabama State's oral history project. And so we sat with each one of you all and had you relate to us, and we recorded your stories. And so we have a record of your stories and knew that your experiences were specific to this particular occasion. So I would encourage people who have a story to be sure to see me and to be able to participate in the oral history project at Alabama State. We're going to dedicate the next part of the program to allowing our panelists to give a brief 5-minute overview of their own personal observations about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its aftermath as they reflect on it. And we'll start at the end with Attorney Seay.
Thank you. I was hoping that you could go to the end with Attorney Seay. A lot of emphasis as it relates to the 64 Civil Rights Act has been placed too much in my judgment on matters of lesser importance in the category of things that were attempted to be corrected by the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Dr. Robertson, of course, has outlined briefly those areas that addressed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And in my judgment, Dr. Robertson expressed the kind of optimism that Seay just does not enjoy. A part of it, for example, was equal employment. And incidentally, the public accommodations section that Dr. Robertson mentioned was implemented immediately, while the provisions relating to discrimination in employment were delayed for a year. Now, I don't think that that was sheer happenstance. I think that came from the wisdom of that great Southern politician, Lyndon Johnson, who ultimately put in place the Civil Rights Act. He decided that he would make the public accommodation section implemented immediately and delay equal employment, thinking perhaps that would delay actual implementation of the public accommodations section. After all, without the jobs, it was anticipated that he could not go out to these places to eat. And to a large extent, he was correct. I did a Jim Crow meeting, which I hope everybody here eventually will read if you haven't read it. One of the stories in that book was about the old Eli Cafe in Montgomery. And if there's anybody in here as old as me, you will remember that restaurant. It was the eating place of the white politicians, the white judges, the white lawyers, the white economically elite. Fred and I walked passed it every day, coming from federal court to our office. And I longed for the day that I could go in the United restaurant and eat. Well, Lyndon Johnson saw to that, and on the day, incidentally, Lyndon signed that bill at 6:20 for some reason that evening. And on that day, 2nd of July, 64, I carried my family to the Eli for dinner. We got there about 5 o'clock. We were ushered in, we were seated cordially, and we sat there. Finally, after about 30 minutes, I summoned the server and asked, or rather stated, "You are going to serve us." She said, "Well, you have to talk to the matron." I said, "Well, whoever that is and whatever that means, send him to me." And he came over, and I asked him, I said, "Now, you are going to serve us, aren't you?" He said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "I'm told that President Johnson is going to sign the bill at 6:20. We're going to serve you at 6:20 and not one damn minute before." And so we waited. Funny part about it is I had a daughter then about 2. She was in one of these high chairs, and my wife and I were talking and ignoring her. And she kept trying to get, my daughter kept trying to get my attention. And I kept ignoring her. So finally she said, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." And I said, "What you want, kid?" And she said just as loudly as she could, "Daddy, I dropped my rag." I said, "You did what?" She said, "I dropped my rag." I told my wife then, I said, "Now, I want at least one day a week at home, formal dinner service with linen, tablecloths, and napkins, so that my kids will grow up knowing the difference between a napkin and a rag." 64 Civil Rights Act accomplished that.
We're gonna move. Ideally, we're gonna have time for some interaction after the comments are made. So we're gonna move to our next panelist, Dr. Bryson.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. Attorney Seay, you've given me some light into some things that I did not know. But one of the first things that I remember as a member of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church after Martin came was that one of his pronouncements was that everybody in the church should become a registered voter. And what a marvelous statement that was. He did crunch a few toes in his opening statements, but he was right